As you see, I'm here with the legendary Grammy Award winning Peabo Bryson. Oh my gosh, it's so good to have you.
When Peabo Bryson passed away, fans around the world believed they were saying goodbye to one of the greatest voices in music history. But what happened after his death caught many by surprise. FBI officials began looking through his mansion. They reportedly uncovered items, records, and personal details that few people knew existed. The discoveries raised new questions about the private life of a man who spent decades in the spotlight while keeping much of himself hidden from the world. What secrets was Peabo Bryson carrying behind closed doors? And what did investigators find that shocked so many people? Join us as we explore the life, legacy, and surprising discoveries connected to one of music's most unforgettable voices. A boy from Greenville. Greenville, South Carolina in the 1950s was a place shaped by hard work, quiet faith, and the kind of community life that kept people close to each other even when resources were thin. And it was into this world that Robert Peabo Bryson was born on April 9, 1951, the son of a family that did not have much by material measure but carried something that proved more durable than money. Music was part of daily life in the Bryson household, the way it was in many black Southern families of that era, woven into church services, front porch evenings, and the rhythms of ordinary days. And young Peabo absorbed it naturally, the way children absorb the things that surround them before they are old enough to make a conscious choice about what they love. Church was where he first sang in front of people, standing in the kind of small congregation where everyone knows everyone, and the music is not performance so much as participation. And even then, even as a boy, there was something in his voice that made people pay attention. A warmth and a steadiness that felt different from the usual childhood singing, more centered, more naturally controlled. He was not pushing to be noticed. He simply sounded like himself, and that turned out to be enough to make people stop and listen. Outside of church, he sang wherever he could, in local groups, at community gatherings, at any small event that gave him a few minutes in front of an audience, building without quite knowing it, the early foundation of what would eventually become one of the most recognizable voices in American music. But Greenville in the 1950s was also a place defined by racial segregation, and the distance between a young black boy singing in a church choir and a professional music career was not just a matter of talent or ambition. It was a distance shaped by systemic barriers that turned genuine dreams into something that could feel almost theoretical. Nice to imagine, difficult to take seriously as an actual plan for a life. The adults around him were not discouraging people. They were practical people who understood the world they lived in, and the world they lived in did not offer many visible paths from where Peabo was standing to where his voice suggested he might be capable of going. He watched that gap and decided, quietly and without announcement, that he was going to find a way across it. What that choice really cost him, the years of pain, the constant rejection, the slow, difficult climb before the music world paid attention, was a story that still had to be told. And it was a much harder story than most of the people who later bought his albums ever realized. Chasing success against the odds. The path from a church choir in Greenville to a recording contract was not a straight line. And for Peabo Bryson, it stretched across years of small venues, unpaid performances, cheap travel, and the particular exhaustion that comes from wanting something very much, while the evidence around you keeps suggesting it may not happen. He moved through the circuit of clubs and local stages that existed below the level of industry attention, places where the audiences were small and the pay was inconsistent, and the goal was simply to keep performing, to stay sharp, to be ready for an opportunity that had not yet appeared and showed no clear sign of arriving. This period tested him in practical ways. Money was a persistent problem, the kind that shapes daily decisions and wears down confidence over time. And the music industry in that era was not a welcoming environment for young black artists without connections, without management, and without the kind of polished commercial package that label executives felt they could sell without risk. He had his voice. He had his instinct for a song. He had the discipline that came from years of singing in situations where you had to hold an audience's attention without the support of production or reputation. What he did not have was anyone in a position of power willing to take a chance on him. And in the music business, that gap is often the one that ends careers before they properly begin. Rejection from record labels is a common part of almost every successful musician's early story. But knowing that does not make it easier to absorb, especially when the rejections come with the specific message that his style, the warm, intimate, romantic sound he was naturally drawn toward, was not considered commercially viable at the time. Too soft for some markets, too specific for others, not fitting neatly into the categories that label executives used to predict what would sell. What kept him going was not a single dramatic moment of renewed belief. It was something quieter and more stubborn than that, a basic refusal to accept that the voice he had, the one that had been making people stop and listen since he was a child in a church pew, was not worth something to someone, somewhere, eventually. He kept performing. He kept refining. He paid attention to what landed with audiences and what did not, absorbing practical knowledge about how to deliver a song that no studio education could have provided. The industry would come around. It just took longer than it should have. When the opportunity finally arrived, it did not just change his career. It changed what people understood a romantic ballad could sound like. The rise of a romantic superstar. The breakthrough, when it came through Capitol Records, and what followed was the kind of career acceleration that makes the years of struggle look, in retrospect, like preparation rather than failure, though it never quite feels that way while you are living through them. Peabo Bryson's early recordings for Capitol introduced his voice to a wider audience, and what that audience responded to was not complicated to describe, but was genuinely difficult to manufacture. He sounded sincere. In a genre where romantic feeling was the entire point, where the whole transaction between singer and listener depended on the listener believing that the emotion being expressed was real, he delivered something that did not feel performed or calculated. It felt like a man who actually meant what he was singing. That quality, combined with a voice that had been developed through years of live performance into something with both power and gentleness, gave him a signature style that was immediately recognizable and proved remarkably consistent across different songs, different producers, and different eras. His romantic ballads found an audience that was hungry for exactly what he was offering. Music that did not demand anything difficult from the listener, that created a particular emotional atmosphere and sustained it, that treated love as something worth taking seriously and singing about with full commitment. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, that audience grew steadily, built not through sudden viral moments, but through the slower, more durable accumulation of people who heard one song, went looking for more, and found an entire catalog that delivered the same quality of feeling each time. Radio play helped. So did the emerging format of quiet storm programming, a style of late-night R&B radio that was perfectly suited to his sound and gave him consistent exposure to listeners in exactly the mood his music was designed for. He became a fixture in that world, the kind of artist whose name became associated with a specific emotional register, so that over time, putting on a Peabo Bryson record communicated something even before the first note played. His live performances built loyalty of a different kind, more personal and more lasting, because seeing him perform made clear that the warmth in the recordings was not a studio construction. It was simply who he was as a singer. By the early 1980s, he was one of the most recognizable voices in R&B, with a fan base that crossed demographic lines and a reputation in the industry as someone who could be trusted to deliver, in the studio and on stage, every time. What came next would take that reputation and multiply it in ways even his most devoted fans did not see coming. The women behind the hits. There is a particular kind of magic that happens when two voices find each other in a recording studio and produce something that neither could have made alone. And Peabo Bryson found that magic more consistently than almost any other artist of his generation, building a second identity as a duet partner that eventually became as important to his legacy as anything he recorded on his own. The collaborations came one by one, each one adding something new to what people understood his voice was capable of, and each one reaching an audience that a solo recording might not have touched in quite the same way. Roberta Flack was the first partnership that truly changed things. The two recorded together with a chemistry that felt natural and unforced, their voices complementing each other in a way that sounded less like two singers performing the same song and more like two people genuinely sharing a conversation. And the result was something radio responded to immediately. Tonight I Celebrate My Love, recorded with Flack in 1983, became one of the defining recordings of his career, a song so warmly constructed and so honestly delivered that it found its way into weddings, anniversaries, and quiet evenings in homes around the world, becoming one of those songs that people attach to specific moments in their own lives and never quite let go of. That is a particular kind of success, quieter than chart dominance but more durable, and it came directly from the duet format that he had made his own. Regina Belle followed, and then others, each collaboration chosen with a care that suggested he understood something important about what made these partnerships work, that the chemistry had to be genuine, that the voices had to actually suit each other rather than simply being placed together for commercial reasons, and that the emotional content of the song had to be something both singers could deliver without it feeling like a performance. The rumors and speculation that followed some of these partnerships were a natural consequence of recordings that sounded so genuinely intimate, and Peabo Bryson largely declined to feed those stories, preferring to let the music speak for itself, which it did, consistently and loudly enough that the speculation never seriously threatened what he had built. What the duets did, beyond producing individual hits, was establish him as someone uniquely capable of creating a certain kind of shared emotional space in a recording, a skill that would prove more valuable than anyone around him realized at the time. His voice made people feel less alone, and that turned out to be something an enormous number of people were looking for. But fame of that kind comes attached to pressures that rarely make it into the songs, and what was building behind the scenes was considerably less comfortable than anything on the records. Fame comes with a price. Fame looks one way from the outside and feels a completely different way from the inside. And for Peabo Bryson, the years when his career was at its most visible were also the years that demanded the most from him in ways that had nothing to do with singing. Touring was the engine that kept everything running. Record sales built a name, but live performance was what sustained a career financially and kept an artist present in the minds of fans between albums. And Peabo Bryson toured extensively, moving from city to city through schedules that left very little room for anything that was not directly related to the next show or the next recording session. The physical demands of that life are easy to underestimate from a distance. Maintaining a voice as the central instrument of your career while traveling constantly, sleeping in different beds, eating irregularly, and performing night after night in venues with varying acoustics and conditions requires a level of discipline and self-management that goes far beyond simply being talented, and it takes a toll that accumulates slowly and is hard to see until it has already added up to something significant. Beyond the physical demands were the industry pressures, the constant conversation about what was selling, what direction his sound should take, whether he needed to modernize his approach to stay competitive with younger artists entering the same market, and how to manage the expectations of a fan base that loved him for a specific sound, while the industry around him kept shifting in new directions. These are not unusual pressures for a successful musician to face. They come with the territory. But they are also pressures that do not disappear between shows, that follow an artist into the quiet moments that the public never sees, and that require a kind of ongoing emotional management that rarely gets acknowledged in the celebration of someone's success. The personal sacrifices were real, relationships strained under schedules that made ordinary domestic life difficult to sustain, Time with family was something that had to be planned around a career that did not naturally make room for it, and the gap between the romantic figure his music projected and the practical reality of a life organized almost entirely around professional demands was sometimes wide. He carried it without complaint, at least publicly, presenting the warmth and steadiness that audiences had come to associate with him, and doing the work that was in front of him with the same quiet commitment he had shown since the early club days. But even that commitment could not fully protect him from what was coming next, when the music industry began moving in a direction that left him standing in a place he had not expected. When the spotlight began to fade, the music industry in the late 1980s was changing quickly, and not in ways that were kind to artists whose sound was built around warmth, intimacy, and the kind of slow, careful romantic ballad that had defined the previous decade. New Jack Swing arrived with a harder, more rhythmic energy that felt immediately contemporary and pushed older sounds toward the edges of radio playlists. Younger artists were coming up with production styles built around drum machines, synthesizers, and a faster tempo that suited the mood of the moment. And the quiet storm format that had been so good to Peabo Bryson was losing ground to formats that favored fresher names and newer sounds. Record sales that had once come reliably began to soften. Radio play became harder to secure. The industry conversations that had once centered on what his next project should sound like began to shift toward quieter, more uncertain discussions about whether the audience that had made him successful was still large enough and engaged enough to justify the same level of investment. This is a moment that arrives in many long careers, and it is one of the more difficult things a successful artist has to navigate because it does not come with a clear announcement or a defined turning point. It creeps in gradually through smaller bookings, shorter label meetings, and the particular silence that falls when people who used to call regularly stop calling quite so often. For Peabo Bryson, who had spent years building something real and durable through genuine hard work, the experience of watching that work become less visible was a particular kind of disappointment, made sharper by the fact that the music itself had not changed. He was still capable of delivering exactly what had made people love him in the first place. But the industry around him was measuring value in a different currency now. Industry insiders, the kind who speak freely in private and carefully in public, began to suggest that his best years were probably behind him, that the sound he represented belonged to an era that had passed, and that reinvention, the kind that required abandoning what made him distinctive in the first place, was probably his only realistic path forward. It was the kind of assessment that ends careers, delivered with the particular confidence of people who believe they understand what audiences want better than the artists themselves. What nobody in those conversations accounted for was a phone call that was about to come from a direction none of them were looking, and that phone call would produce one of the most unexpected comebacks in the entire history of popular music. The Disney Miracle. The phone call came from Walt Disney Pictures, and it was not the kind of opportunity that anyone in the music industry had been predicting for Peabo Bryson at that particular moment in his career, which made it either very good timing or very good fortune, depending on how you look at it. Disney was working on Beauty and the Beast, an animated film that the studio believed in deeply, and was approaching with a level of care and ambition that went well beyond their recent output. And they needed a voice for the title song, something that could carry the emotional weight of the film's central story, and deliver it in a way that felt genuinely moving rather than simply pleasant. Someone at Disney thought of Peabo Bryson. He came into the project alongside Celine Dion, a pairing that, on paper, made a certain kind of sense, given both artists' connection to romantic material, and what the two of them produced in the studio together was something that exceeded what either the film or the song might have achieved with different voices attached to it. Beauty and the Beast, the song, was released in 1991 alongside the film, and what happened next moved faster and reached further than almost anyone involved had anticipated. The film was a massive success, seen by audiences of all ages in countries around the world, and the title song went with it everywhere. carried by a story that connected with people on a level that transcended age, language, and background. The Grammy came, confirming officially what audiences had already decided for themselves, that this was one of the great romantic recordings of its era. And suddenly, the industry conversations about whether Peabo Bryson's best years were behind him looked considerably less informed than the people having them had believed. He was not finished. He was, in a very real sense, just beginning a second chapter that reached a generation of listeners who had been children when his original run of hits was playing on their parents' radios, and who now had a reason of their own to find out who he was. A Whole New World followed, recorded for Aladdin in 1992 with Regina Bell, and it repeated the achievement, winning another Grammy and confirming that what had happened with Beauty and the Beast was not an accident, but a reflection of something consistent in his voice and his ability to inhabit a song completely. 2 Disney films, 2 iconic songs, 2 Grammys, and an audience that now spanned multiple generations. The career that industry insiders had quietly written off had just become the story everyone was talking about. But behind the comeback and the celebration, there was a version of Peabo Bryson that the cameras never quite captured. And the people who worked closest with him had stories that the public had never heard. The secrets behind the success. The people who worked with Peabo Bryson in recording studios over the decades tell a version of him that is consistent enough across different voices and different eras to feel like a reliable picture. And what that picture shows is an artist whose public warmth was entirely genuine, but whose professional standards were considerably less easygoing than his relaxed stage presence suggested. He was a perfectionist in the way that serious craftspeople tend to be, not loud about it, not difficult in the way that makes sessions unpleasant, but quietly and persistently focused on getting things right, willing to run a vocal take as many times as necessary until it sat the way he believed it should, and genuinely uncomfortable settling for something that was merely good when he believed something better was available if he kept working. Producers across different decades describe him as a well-prepared singer who understood each song's needs, planned his delivery carefully, and listened critically to playback. He treated recording as a serious responsibility, aware that his voice would stay with listeners for years. He also maintained strict discipline, protecting his vocal health through careful management, rest, and consistent attention throughout his long career. There were harder periods, health challenges that he managed quietly and without making them part of his public story. Moments when the instrument he had built his life around required more careful handling than the schedule around him naturally allowed. His influence on younger singers operated mostly below the surface of public conversation, in the specific technical choices he made in a recording, the way he approached phrasing and breath control, and the micro-decisions within a single line of melody that separate competent singing from something that genuinely moves people. Artists who grew up listening to him and later found themselves in recording studios of their own often discovered that his fingerprints were on habits they had developed without quite knowing where those habits came from, absorbed so thoroughly through years of listening that they had become part of how those artists understood what good singing felt like. He shaped the standard without ever making a point of doing so. The final chapter of his life was quieter than the ones that came before it, but no less meaningful to the people who were paying attention. The final years. There comes a point in most long careers when the pace of things changes naturally, and the relationship between an artist and their work shifts from something driven by ambition and forward momentum to something that looks more like reflection, a slower and more considered engagement with what has been built and what it means. For Peabo Bryson, that shift came gradually, the way most honest changes in a life tend to come, not as a single decision, but as an accumulation of smaller ones. A tour declined here, a recording session approached differently there, a growing preference for the things that touring and studio work had made scarce for so long. Time at home, ordinary days, the quieter rhythms of a life not organized entirely around performance. He stayed connected to music and his longtime fans, attending events where his presence felt meaningful and giving warm, reflective interviews that showed comfort with his career and honesty about its demands. In 2019, he suffered a heart attack and spoke openly about it, describing recovery simply, with gratitude and a clearer sense of priorities. The recovery was real, and the gratitude was real, and people who saw him perform in the years that followed reported that there was something different in how he engaged with his music, not diminished, but deepened, as though the experience of nearly losing the ability to do what he loved had clarified for him exactly what it was that he loved about it. He talked about his catalog in these later years with the affection of someone who had lived long enough with their own work to hear it the way other people heard it, to understand why certain songs had attached themselves so permanently to so many different lives, and to feel something genuinely moved by that, rather than simply proud of it. The legacy he had built was not something he seemed to carry as a burden or wear as a badge. It was simply there, around him, in the songs that kept playing in places he would never visit, and in the memories of people he would never meet. That legacy, and the question of what made it so lasting, is where this story has been heading all along. The legacy that refuses to fade. Some artists are popular for a season, riding a particular sound or moment until the moment passes and the sound ages, and then they become nostalgic, pleasant to revisit, but no longer capable of reaching someone who was not already there the first time. Peabo Bryson never became that. His songs kept finding new listeners long after the charts had moved on, carried forward by the Disney recordings into the lives of children who grew up singing Beauty and the Beast, without knowing anything else about him, and then went looking, and found an entire catalog waiting for them, warm and consistent and built to last. The tributes that came in after his passing reflected something genuine, not the polite remembrance that greets the death of anyone who was once famous, but the specific grief of people who felt that something personally meaningful had left the world. Fans who attached particular songs to particular moments in their own lives and felt those moments suddenly become more fragile. Fellow artists spoke about his influence in terms that pointed to something technical as much as emotional. The way he handled a phrase, the patience he brought to a lyric, the understanding he had of what a listener needed from a romantic song, which was not to be impressed, but to be understood. What made him different from other romantic singers of his generation was finally a simple thing dressed up in years of craft and discipline. He sounded like he meant it, every time, in every song, across every decade. And that consistency of feeling in a world that produces a great deal of music, but very little that genuinely moves people, turned out to be rarer and more valuable than anyone had thought to measure. The voice is gone. The feeling it carried is still here. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.